Hi, it's Alex. Let's take a look at Bible arcing in Galatians 2:15 to 16 today. We ourselves are Jews by birth, Paul says, and not Gentile sinners. Yet, we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So, we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified. So Paul is setting a pace here in Galatians 2 for really the main point that he's going to make in the book of Galatians in a very focused and concentrated couple of verses here. And I would just say, as an aside, verse 16 particularly would be a great verse just to memorize and to be meditating on, as Paul gives a lot of truth in a short space. So let's start to break this passage down into its various propositions and see what we come up with. First proposition, we ourselves are Jews by birth. Then we hit this word and, key word, and not Gentile sinners. Then we have a semicolon, so a third proposition, yet, probably pointing us to a concessive relationship. We know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but, key word, next proposition, through faith in Christ. A person is justified through faith in Jesus Christ. Comma, so, another key word here. We also have believed in Christ Jesus. Another proposition is begun by this in order, or in order to be, in order, pointing probably to some relationship of purpose here, in order to be justified by faith in Christ. And another key word, another proposition, not by works of the law. So I would set that on its own. Comma, because, another key word, probably pointing to the relationship of ground, because by works of the law no one will be justified. So I would make that last phrase its own proposition. So now let me write these out according to their individual propositions so we can begin to look at the relationships between all the propositions. Okay, I've written out these two verses by their individual propositions, and I've labeled each proposition, and then I've drawn my line, my arc over each proposition so we can begin to look at the relationship between these propositions. So where do we begin? Well, I like to begin at the beginning. What we have first is we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. There's a contrast between these two ethnic identities set up, but it's joined by the simple word and so we have a simple series that is being set up. So I'm going to label this as a series as my first move, and then I see this word yet. We are Jews by birth, not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is not justified by works. So Paul is going to contrast these two ethnic identities with something different. There's a concessive relationship here. And as I've read over this passage, it seems to me that verse 16 is of a piece. Here is one thought that he's putting together, and that's further emphasized by this semicolon here. So verse 16 is not a separate sentence, and yet there is a semicolon here separating verses 15 and 16. So I'm going to take a risk. And it's pretty low risk because I have an eraser. But I'm going to draw one arc over the top of all of these propositions in verse 16, recognizing that I think there's going to be a concessive relationship that covers all of verse 16 in relationship to verse 15. And so often we're working from the ground up when we're starting with each individual proposition. So that's true. But there are times, and I think this is one of them, where we can start at the top and work down. start at the overview of this and then work into each of these individual relationships. So I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here. I'm going to label this as concessive and say that I think this is the relationship over the whole of verses 15 and 16 because of this word yet. And then I'm going to start to work in the individual relationships under the arc of verse 16. So the next thing that my eye sees is this word but. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So there's a direct alternative that's being set up there, and really even more than an alternative, we have a negative positive, not justified, but. So we have a not but relationship here. And so I'm going to label this as a negative positive relationship. Draw my arc over the top. And then my eye travels down to proposition 16c. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified. And I see again this very basic relationship of series here. In order, he says, to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. So this similar language of verse 15, we're Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, in order to be justified by Christ and not by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. So similar language, but it's joined by a simple series, a simple and. So I'm going to label this as a series right here. Before I come back to the relationship of between C and DE, so we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order, so we have language of purpose here, that he's done something with a purpose in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. So I think what we have here is an action purpose. Action purpose. I'm going to draw my arc over that. That is this action of believing. So we also have believed. This is full of purpose, and the purpose is made explicit here, in order to be justified by faith in Christ. The reason we have believed, he says, is in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. So we have an action with a purpose attached to it, and then a grounding statement here to finish it off. Because by works of the law, no one will be justified. So we see this key word, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. So this reinforces, is the reason why he has believed, Paul says, in order to be justified by faith, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. So we have a ground relationship here. And then we need to identify still the relationship that is hinged right here between 16ab and the rest of verse 16. And the word that we're given is this word so, which I've said, depending on the word in the Greek behind this English word so, sometimes the ESV translates the word un in the Greek, which is therefore, as so. And actually the word here in the Greek is the word and, is the word kai, not the word so. And so while there does seem to be kind of the sense of therefore here, we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. Therefore, we have also believed in Christ Jesus. I'm going to go with what the text literally says, and that is, and. We know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ. So I'm going to label this simply as a series. I already have my arc drawn over the top there, connecting these two arcs. And this is how I would arc verses 15 and 16. Okay, after we've arced out our passage, we can step back and make some observation. In fact, I think it's important to step back and give yourself a space to just observe, to chew over, to meditate on what you're looking at here. So I'm going to step back, and the first thing I notice is that Paul starts off with this language of identity in verse 15. We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. He even borrows seemingly the language of his opponents, kind of, I think, gently making fun of the language they're using, as if those who are of Gentile origin are sinners and those who are of Jewish origin are righteous. So he's recognizing that ethnic background and reality. He concedes that standing, that truth, and yet he's pointing to a new reality that is received because of faith in Christ. And he's arguing, I think, in verse 16 here, that birth is no advantage here, that they're Jews by birth. We know this, and yet he's saying it's no advantage. Neither are works prescribed by their understanding of the Torah and what it means to keep the Torah, that's no longer any advantage to them. It's no advantage to them as over against those who are of Gentile background, because God, Paul says, doesn't approve people on that basis, but only through faith. In fact, he emphasizes this. He says, we know, he says, that a person is not justified by works of the law. We know this. So because of that knowledge, we have believed in Christ, he says. Because of what we know, that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ, so we have also believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ. So because of that knowledge, we have believed in Christ. And so we have this series right here, which I would say has a strong inference flavor. That it's because of this knowledge that we also have believed, which is where we could almost, I'm tempted to draw this inference, the three dots for therefore in the relationship, but I think I'm content saying this is a series with a strong inference flavor here, that we know this is true, and so that has spurred our belief. So we've also believed in Christ in order to be justified by faith in Christ. There's this sandwiching of what we know here, that a person is not justified by works of the law, and then here in 16f, because by works of the law no one will be justified. So we have this sandwich of what we know, Paul says, about no one being justified by works of the law. And because we know that, so then, he says, and we have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ, because we know both pieces of bread on this sandwich. We know that a person is not justified by works of the law, and because by works of the law no one will be justified. So then, this seems to be more and more centrally important. And the central idea, this action that Paul says he's taken for this purpose, we have also believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ. The more I read over this, especially in light of this arcing, the more I see C and D here as central to everything Paul is arguing in this short, pithy section. And I think there's a possible chiastic organization here, and I'm not alone in this. I know it's easy to get into the trap of seeing chiasms everywhere, but David De Silva also sees a chiasm here. He organizes his a little bit differently than this, but if I detach this opening statement of contrast, we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, then we end up with this possible structure where we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, paralleled by, because by works of the law no one will be justified. And then that points us then from A and A prime, to this reality that through faith in Jesus Christ, people are justified, and not by works of the law, which then points us again to this central reality here in what we identified as propositions C and D. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith. The more I look at this, the more this seems to be central. And so I'm not necessarily arguing for this entire chiasm, but I do think that these two propositions seem to be central to what Paul is arguing for in this passage. And it brings me back and seems to reinforce what we've identified so far. That Paul says we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified. And it points to this central reality, this action and purpose. We have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ. In other words, Paul's main idea is that he's pointing to as he's getting going in Galatians is that circumcision or other works of the law won't benefit you. No work of the law will benefit you, because no one is justified by works. So knowing this, then Paul is believing in anticipation of being justified by faith in Christ Jesus. He's believing in anticipation, and this gives Galatians, seemingly over against Romans, its unique flavor of this idea of anticipating justification and believing in that hope. And we see that here in verses 15 and 16.